let's do the bonus problem for problem set 1. The challenge was calculate the distance between points, 2 points in an n-dimensional Euclidean space. So all of this text here is describing how you can extend the ordinary distance formula that you know into 3 dimensions, or then into any number of higher dimensions, into n dimensions. And several people asked about this, and I replied to them in email, but we'll talk a lot more about this, and it will make it more intuitive sense later in the year when we cover machine learning. For now, let's just do the code. So we'll need a method called makeRandomPoint, where we tell it the number of dimensions, like how many coordinates for our point, and then what the maximum value should be for our coordinates. So let's do that much. We're going to represent the point as an array list of double. So the list is a bunch of numbers, and each number represents a different coordinate. I'll call that point 1, and then makeRandomPoint. And we're going to do it in a 784 dimensional space, and values only between 0 and 10. Okay, we got to import array list, so I'll hit Alt-Enter, and that added this import java.util.ArrayList. I'm going to put my cursor on makeRandomPoint, hit Alt-Enter, and create the method signature for this method. I do want to return an array list of double, but these, and do I want these to be ints? Let's think about it. So it is possible to have dimensionality that is not an integer, but that's a little beyond the scope of our talk here. So we'll keep it to an integer number of dimensions, and I'm going to call this numCoords. I'm trying to name it something that will have meaning for me. And so when I ask myself, what is 784, I answer, it is the number of coordinates I want. So numCoords seems like a good name. For max value, so this one can be a double, because it's perfectly fine, in fact, probably desirable to have coordinates that are not integers. So I will call this max value. Okay, so let's think about what I want to do. I want to return a list, so that means I'll need to create a variable that is that list that I'll eventually return. So I'll call it point, new array list, and I hit tab to autocomplete all that. Okay, great. So I've created this array list, but it's length 0. How long do I want it to be? Oh, number of coordinates. So I'm going to loop that many times. I'll type for I to create a loop, hit enter or tab to autocomplete. And I'm going to loop up to numCoords. And notice how I'm doing a lot of hitting tab and enter so that I don't have to type full words. All right, so this is now going to repeat this many times. So if numCoords is 784, this will repeat 784 times. What do I want to do 784 times? I want to make a random number for the coordinate, and then I want to add it to the end of the list. All right, so making a random number, I'll say, I don't want to cast to int. I almost automatically did it because we do that so frequently. But we want the values to be doubles, so there's no reason to cast to int. So I'll do math.random times max value. And so now this represents a random number between 0 and the max value. How do I add it to the list? I have point is the name of my list, and I'll do dot add, and then the value I want to add. Okay, I'm going to get rid of all of the comments. The comments were for you, but I think that to a seasoned programmer, this would read just fine and be interpretable. And I even think maybe it's not worthwhile to have that val. I'm just going to put this directly inside my add. Okay, so this is a little bit shorter now. And then I'll return point. Now let me just go back in my mind and make sure I'm doing all the things I need to do. The purpose of this is to return a list that represents a random point. I create the list, I loop the right number of times, and I fill it with random values, and then I return it. Okay, so I think I'm doing all the things I want to do. Let's go ahead and run it. I don't know. I suspect it might not actually display, and I'll tell you why if it doesn't. Oh, it did. Okay. So I can scroll horizontally, and you can see all 784 values here. If we wanted to test it in an easier to verify way visually, I'll make it 3 coordinates, and now we can see that it's really just returning a list of 3 coordinates. Let's go back to 784 again. I mentioned that it might not have displayed. I think sometimes in IntelliJ, if something is going to display too far horizontally, for some reason it just doesn't display at all, having to do with the display buffer, or like the window buffer. I don't know about it, but it happens sometimes. Okay, so we got 1 point. Let's make a second point, point 2. And then the method call here is just the same. And finally, let's have distance. So we're going to calculate the distance between point 1 and point 2. Notice I am still programming by intention. I am typing the name of the method that I want to exist before I actually make it. All right, you'll notice this isn't in red, so I can't hit Alt-Enter here. Oh, I can. Great. So I already have a method called distance. Oops. I already have a method called distance down here, but this distance method takes 4 doubles as input. I want a different distance method that takes 2 array lists as input. But it's totally okay, as you can see right now. It's totally okay to have 2 different methods both called distance, as long as they take different kinds of inputs. That's a concept called overloading, and we'll talk about that later in the year also. Okay, how do I calculate the distance formula? Well, I am going to create a variable that will represent the overall distance. Actually, no, sorry. Let's make sum. Because if I think conceptually, what I really want to do is math.square root of like dimension 1 minus, like 0.1, like first dimension, minus 0.2 first dimension squared. I don't have a good way of notating this. And then I'm going to add that to 0.1 second dimension minus 0.2 second dimension squared, and so on. So I want to add together like a whole bunch of these squared things. So I think I will make a sum variable to hold all of those squared differences that I'm going to be adding together. Let's loop through the list. So I'm going to go from 0 to points.size. If you know about for each loops, that's a good thought to have here, but I actually need to know the index because I need to access coordinates from both lists. Okay, so I can represent the index. It starts at 0, and to get the values I want, I'm gonna say diff as like the difference in value between 2 corresponding coordinates. So I can say 0.1.getI minus 0.2.getI. So all this is saying, so the first time through the loop, I is 0. So 0.1.get0 is going to return the first number in the list. And this will be the first number in the other list. And so now this is the difference between the first number in both lists. And then the second time through the loop, it'll be the difference in value between the second number in each list, and so on. And what I really want to do is I really want to say sum plus equals that difference, because I want to take those differences. Oh, I want to square them. Excuse me. So let's diff times diff. So now I'm squaring each difference, and I'm adding it into sum. At the end, I can return math.square root of that sum. And that should work. Somebody wanted to know, here, let's print out the answer here. So we can definitely run it and see, if it crashes. It doesn't crash, it gives me a number, but some people wanted to know, how do we know if that number is correct? Well, a really important rule when you are testing your code is set up a test case that is easy to check the answer for. So it would be pretty hard for us to check by hand the distance between two 784 dimensional points. But if I set this up to be like 2 dimensions, for example, I could print out what each one was. So I could print out 0.1 and then 0.2. And if I wanted to, I could very easily check this by hand on the calculator. So here's xy of 0.1, here's xy of 0.2. If that seems like something you don't want to do, you could also hand construct 2 lists that have coordinates that you choose so that you don't have to type in long strings of numbers. So for example, I could do something like this. Array list double 0.1, oops, equals new array list. I'm going to create it with some values already inside it. And the way you can do that is you can say arrays.asList. And now you can give it a comma separated list. You have to import arrays by doing Alt-Enter. So let's say I want, I don't know, 0, 1. And then what's the problem? Oh, there we go. And now let's do another one here, which I'll call point 2, and that can be 1, 0. So now you can see I've created a point at 0, 1 and a point at 1, 0. You can hand compute that, and the distance should be the square root of 2, and then you can verify that the output of our method is actually giving you the square root of 2. So that's a nice thing to keep in mind, especially as your programs get more complicated, is set up testing scenarios that are going to be pretty easy for you to verify yourself by hand.